Erev Tov, good evening. Being a refugee puts me in a very different category. Some people insisted that we all are Holocaust survivors. I do not agree. I think there are refugees and there are survivors. And there are the people who didn't survive. I'm going to try to, we don't have all that much time. We want to leave, judging by this wonderful response in terms of people coming, I think we'll have lots of good discussions. So I'd like to leave more time than I had intended. So I'd like to speak about two or three things. One is the general condition that prevailed in Switzerland vis-a-vis Jewish refugees. And then the second point I'd like to speak about is how women were the linchpin in Switzerland during the war. And then the issue that Renata spoke about, that everyone has to speak about, is the separation of children. And of course that's a problem that we know exists today in parts of the world. And the heartbreak then and the heartbreak now, great similarities. So let me first of all say that this, speaking about women, this is not going to be a comparison of suffering at all. In the Holocaust, men and women were victims, and that's all there is to it. I was very, very lucky. I'm among the fortunate to have survived in Switzerland. Now, you will want to know why Switzerland, but let me just say, as they say in Yiddish, I'd like to say a few words before I begin to speak. I think that's a great phrase. Okay. When I was sort of thinking about speaking today, I had a very cavalier attitude. I thought, well, of course, it'll be an intimate little group and we'll chat away. But then I realized that I am the last of a generation that is still young enough and old enough to be able to give firsthand expression to what I went through and what millions of others did. And of course, I keep referring to being fortunate. I don't mean it to be cloying, but the point is, one has to remember that at the time in the 40s, which is when I came to Switzerland from 42 to 46, Jews all over the world were being murdered. Children were being made into ashes. And so that we who were fortunate enough to make it into Switzerland, this is our story. So let me just say that the few words that I will say will be based on my own memories. I happen to be blessed with a good memory. It's genetic. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just somebody gave it to me. And also archival. I did a lot of archival research for this book. Now, what I'd like to ask is, how many people really know why Switzerland? Why does Switzerland even come into the question? I mean, there's so many other places that are heartbreaking. Switzerland has a unique place because 25,000 Jews make it into Switzerland. Are you hearing me? I have a loud voice, yeah? Okay. Is this all right? Yeah, okay. 25,000 Jews were able to cross illegally into Switzerland. Anything that I'm saying now we can, amplify later and, go into more details. The reason that Switzerland was such a desirable place was because Switzerland was surrounded by France, Germany, Austria, and Italy, all the countries that were being occupied by the Nazis. And so if you could make your way into Switzerland through these borders that were open, you were among the fortunate ones. Now the Swiss, this is not going to be a pro-Swiss talk. I just want to warn you, if you have a tender spot for them, this may not be pleasant. The Swiss turned away at least as many as they accepted, probably more. The new young historians that want to set the record straight in Switzerland, they're very heroic. They're really, they're good historians and they're also courageous. Some of them say it could be as close as 100,000 who didn't make it to Switzerland, both because they were turned back and it had a name, refoulement, turned back from the border. But also some didn't even try. Now, why did some not try? Because Switzerland, first of all, Switzerland was not only border, in terms of borders, was a place that people would turn to, but also that they had, besides the geography, Switzerland had a reputation of being a humanitarian haven, and maybe a heaven for some of us. And also Switzerland had a reputation, and it was seen as almost as a fact, not a reputation, of being neutral. Now, all these things were false. It was neither a humanitarian haven, nor was it neutral. In fact, Switzerland helped the Nazis. They helped them in many, many ways. We can go over them in some of the main ways that they helped the Nazis were that they were Is it too loud?
Just have to move it back a little bit.
Oh, good, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
They helped the Nazis because, first of all, they were the bankers of the world. Switzerland, at the end of the war, was the richest nation. They were enriched by the war, while other countries suffered destitution of all kinds that we can hardly imagine. The Swiss grew richer. The Swiss had gold bars in their banks with swastikas on them. So they were the bankers for the entire world. All allies, nobody questioned whether you were an ally or whether you were an occupation force. Switzerland was the place that you would put your money and so on. So that, the other thing that Switzerland did was to, I'll show this to you, you can pass it around later. The J stamp on the passport, on Jewish passports. I don't know how many of you know what that is. Let's hope you don't ever have to see it. But this is it. This Jewish passports had J, and you can imagine what that's for. That was ordered by the Swiss, not the Nazis. The Nazis used it, but the Swiss wanted to be sure that everyone knew that the passport was a Jewish passport. Now that had ramifications which were enormous, because it meant that wherever Jews, even if they didn't get into Switzerland, wherever they did go, they would be marked by this J space. That's J space. That's on my mind because we just came from the common. By this J stamp. So this is another way that the Swiss helped the Nazi effort. Not to mention that they were friends with the high-ranking Nazis. The head of the Swiss government, the military, his son provided the barracks for the refugee camps, for the extermination camps. So that's, they were not neutral. And the question, of course, that arises, which we all have to deal with, is what does neutrality mean when it comes to genocide? I mean, Jews were not at war. I mean, people were at war with Jews, but the Jews were, this was not a wartime when neutrality may have some meaning. In this case, it didn't. Okay, so this is, the background. When we speak about women, we have to speak about powerless within powerless groups. So the Jewish women were powerless because they were Jews and women. The Swiss women were powerless because they were women. Swiss women did not get the vote. This is the big democracy in the West. Didn't get the vote until 1971, after Yemen. Yemen, beat them to it. So you had Swiss women not empowered. They really could not vote. They had political power that was very, very minimal. And all Jews were powerless. So we have, layers and layers of powerlessness. In all of this, we still have to see how did women respond? Why do I call women the linchpins? They were linchpins. They provided a humane, civilized presence during a time of unspeakable horror. Now, once again, Switzerland was not a concentration camp. I will be talking about my own little camp. Let me go to that. And you're not linear thinkers, so we can be, okay, we can jump around. Okay, so the camp that I and my mother, and eventually my father later, were very fortunate to be assigned to. In 1943, we crossed the border illegally, and we don't have to go into that. We made it. Fortunately, the reason we did make it is not only it wasn't good luck, it wasn't even luck. Things changed at the border weekly. And the Swiss policy was anti-Semitic. However, Swiss citizens were not necessarily so. So there was a lot of support for Jewish refugees from the media, which was mostly liberal, the socialists, of course, who else? The churches, the liberal churches. So that there was a lot of criticism and really outcry against, the Swiss stopping people at the border and not letting them in. Now you have to realize this, I am jumping around. When they stopped them at the border, refoulement it was called in the French-Swiss border, that meant that they were sending them back to almost certain death. That's it. And the consequences of turning aside and letting a family cross into Switzerland, what did they face? They did not face death the way Polish people who saved others would have faced. They faced a fine. So they were so safe. It was such a safe thing to save Jews, but they didn't. So they let in, at that point, 25,000 Jews. overall, there were about 300,000 immigrants, refugees, deserters, soldiers. Jews were never more than 10% of the saved population. So we're talking now about women, how women were the linchpins, and I'll get to my camp. We were assigned to a place called Morgin. It was in the Valesian Alps. And it was, I eventually called it my Alpine shtetl, because there were 400 Jewish refugees, mostly women. It began as a woman and children's camp. And there's a wonderful, the Swiss community had a very good weekly paper called Israelitische Wochenblatt, the weekly Israelite Jewish weekly. And when the Jews, when refugees came, they began to devote a great many pages to Jewish refugees. So if you wanted to know what was going on in Switzerland with Jews, you just had to read the weekly. And every week had a section called about it spoke about the camps. So we see in there that the rejoicing that there was a new camp devoted to women and children, and it was a kosher camp. And it's very important because it was a Orthodox camp. It played a different role in people's lives. And this, I mean, everything that I'm saying is so much more complicated. I'm trying to be as brief as possible, and then we can unravel it a little bit later. You had, I think, a choice. I'm not sure how it came that some people were in Orthodox camps and others were in more secular ones. However, my parents were Orthodox Jews, and so they were assigned, very fortunately. So what existed in the Orthodox camps was not only kosher, everything was kosher, there was no meat, so that wasn't an issue. But you had a population, don't forget, all the camps, this is true for all of them, had a swath of humanity. You had everybody there. You had, cooks and seamstresses, you had doctors and lawyers and artists, musicians, the whole range of humanity that was fortunate enough to make it to Switzerland was there. So the wonderful thing about this Orthodox camp, and my parents were Orthodox. I am not anymore, but I'm moving towards that again, I think. But anyway, that's another story. Because they were Orthodox, they had a commitment to continuity. And the idea was, nobody knew how long you were going to be as a refugee. But they insisted that whatever length of time they were there, that it be used fruitfully. And so the children got instruction. We got, let me tell you, this is a wonderful part. Our teachers were Beis Yaakov women, Beis Yaakov students. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of that. In some places called Beis Yaakov, some in the Yiddish it's called Beis Yaakov. Anyway, a new wonderful book has just come out by Anita, is it right? No, Naomi Seidman, on the Beis Yaakov schools. This was a whole movement of, she began with her work, this is the head of it, the movement, I'm jumping, but they're all related. So this, Sarah Shanira was the developer of this movement of Orthodox girls. She wanted them to be able to also have a good education, not just learn how to sew and to keep a kosher home, but to really be able to function on a high literary level. So she developed programs. She went to the parents and she said, your daughters are beginning to read Russian novels. This is the Hasidic community that she spoke to. Do you want, they're reading Russian novels, they're going to move. So what we can do to keep them is to teach them to become scholars. So she began with a teacher training program. And they were the most creative. I mean, you ought to read this book. It just came out. It's a wonderful book. It's called Esther Shanira. And blank, there's a subtitle which I've lost. So we were lucky enough that these were our teachers. These were young women who were dedicated, they were compassionate, they were imaginative, they were intelligent, and we adored them. We would have given our lives for them. So a lot of these things just happened because in this particular camp, it was an Orthodox camp. And therefore the Beis Yaakov girls, they were by this point learning how to be teachers, some of them were instructors, were our teachers. So that our lives, and I'm always very reluctant to stress the good fortune, because good fortune in the midst of tragedy and catastrophe is, you have to be very delicate about it. So I'm trying to be. Am I going? Time? I'm bringing it to a close. Okay. So let me just say that there was one wonderful instance. So women were central in once again, in many, many ways, let me give you the highlights once again. Women were central in championing the Jewish refugees. Among them were suffragists. Now, don't forget that these women didn't have the vote yet, so they were suffragists. They were fighting for their voting rights. They gave a lot of that up and gave themselves over to refugee help. The Women Teachers Association became a champion of Jews. So, you know, in so many, many ways that they did that. Okay, so you want me to bring it to an end?
Yeah.
Okay, are you? Okay. All right, no, listen, I'm a very obedient. Okay, so that's that, yeah, okay, so that's it. Jewish women were, in fact, the leaders. They brought civilization, whether they were working as, you know, outside of the camps, as welfare workers and so on, and within the camps. And anyway, we can talk a little bit later, so thank you.